heart of where innovation, money, and power collide in Silicon Valley and beyond. This is Bloomberg Technology with Caroline Hyde and Ed Ludlow.
I'm Caroline Hyde at Bloomberg's World Headquarters in New York. Ed Ludlow is off today. This is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up, we count you down to the FOMC rate decision as VC-exposed banks continue to struggle. We assess what it all means for tech, your investments, the jobs in the sector with VCs and founders across this show. And as we get the C-suite perspective for you too, Adobe CEO, we go live to the Creative Software Giants Summit Conference in Las Vegas. Plus, full coverage on TikTok as its chief prepares to defend the social media company on Capitol Hill tomorrow. Can he assuage lawmakers' push for a ban or a forced sale? We'll bring you those details and so much more throughout the show. First, let's go to the calm before the FOMC storm. We see NASDAQ just up about 0.2%. We're treading water as we see what the FOMC ahead, of course, what Jay Powell has to say, whether indeed we do get that 0.25 percentage point hike. The Europe Stock 600 just up about 0.2%. Notable moves over in the UK, though. European markets still trading and gilt move up 22 basis points. Inflation ramping up, not dialing back below that 10 percentage point level. Key for the Fed to keep in mind, too. Let's flick it on. Let's think about what was once upon a time deemed an inflation hedge, not now, more of a risk asset, but it has been getting a bit higher as we see the bank crisis continue to unfold. We're up another 2%. We are now above to 28,500 on Bitcoin. But I want to bring in the one, the only Kriti Gupta to really delve into some of the micro moves. What else is happening in this market today?
Well, Caroline, it's interesting that you meant that speculative asset of cryptocurrencies. But I'm going to continue that theme with some of our micro here because check out GameStop. You know, we remember this name from 2021, the speculative craze, the meme stock frenzy, and something that was kind of tagging along with the Archegos scandal as well. Nevertheless, today it comes out with a profit, the first profit in 2 years. The CEO saying, look, this is not the same company that we saw 2 years ago. They have made real changes and have a profitability outlook that's going to last their full year. Caro, they haven't actually put numbers on that yet, but it's certainly enough to make the stock soar and soar by a lot. 38% rally in GameStop. Now, is that a meme bid? Is that a frenzy bid? Or is that a fundamental bid? I would argue all of the above because you are seeing some of the ramifications in other meme stocks as well. Take a look at AMC, for example, higher by 3% on the day. Look, there was no news out of AMC last night, but yet it is rallying in tandem with some of the other meme stocks like GameStop. So it's interesting how the fundamental narrative there is actually having a ripple effect throughout the market. I want to stick to another name. Speaking of NVIDIA, for example, higher on the day, given that AI bid. And of course, you also have to keep an eye on the one stock that is trading lower, Nike, even though they had a sales and revenue beat. Earnings are going to be a big picture of the macro story, which brings me to your point, Caroline, the 2-year yield, the FOMC story, 4.16 on the 2-year yield. Even if the Fed does nothing today, we are still seeing a dislocation in the treasury market because that would mean a terminal rate of 4.75. So really prepare for some of that volatility, which is going to have ramifications for the dollar as well, only down by 0.1% today. But that, again, is all going to change at 2 p.m. Gold certainly in focus as it pulls back from that 2,000 level, 1967 on the precious metal, and of course, fueling perhaps some of that defensive bid into the technology sector. The S&P 500 Infotech Index higher by 0.8%, Caroline.
Great to leave us on that tech focus, still trading higher. Kriti Gupta, what a wrap. And I'm pleased to say we can get the CEO perspective on the micro, on their own news, on the macro. Joining us from the Adobe Summit Conference in Las Vegas is Adobe CEO. Shantanu Narayan. It is great to have you, Shantanu, making important announcements as you do on the day, new generative AI offerings. But first, Shantanu, your perspective, sir. You have led this business as CEO since 2007. You know what it's like to lead a giant through a financial instability issue, through a bank crisis. What do you make of the macroeconomic environment for Adobe right now?
Well, Caroline, thank you so much for having me on your show. And as you know, we just announced our Q1 results. And for us, digital really just continues to be a massive tailwind because it's reshaping how we live, how we work, how we're entertained. And Adobe has always really focused on ensuring that we build a company for the long run. You're absolutely right, they're business cycles. But whether it's consumer sentiment or whether it's small and medium business creation or larger enterprises, while there's perhaps more scrutiny, on the expense, people realize that in order to drive profitable growth, technology is one of those areas that you have to continue to invest in. So maybe we're a little more fortunate because we have more mission critical solutions and we have a more diverse portfolio as it relates to geographic exposure. But the company posted really strong results.
Let's talk about amid this desire to continue to focus on R&D. You are, of course, today announcing, or indeed over the last couple of days at your summit, announcing new artificial intelligence iterations in your product, in particular Firefly, the family of generative AI tools. And boy, the one silver lining, the one area of growth that we keep continuing to talk about, no matter what the macro environment is, generative AI models. It's in beta. Can you just give our audience really what this means in terms of text to generating image? What sort of leap is this actually as a user of Adobe?
We think it is really a transformational moment, both for the company as well as for the industry. And Caroline, what we focus on is our vision is how do we unleash creativity for all? It's our assertion and hypothesis that everybody has a story to tell. They would like to tell that story on different media. I was listening to your show and you were talking about what's happening with other platforms like TikTok. But people fear the blank page or the blank slate. And so I think generative AI is a great way to have an on-ramp into being able to take your idea, describe that in words, and then generate an image associated with it. And I think people are also really focused on what are the ethical issues associated with generating, these images. And I think we've taken a very prudent and correct approach. So we think it helps people make our products more accessible, more productive, and more fun.
How are you tackling those legal concerns for creators that perhaps don't want their images used?
That's part of the reason that we are actually starting with a beta, because engaging with the community has been a really important aspect of how we introduce this. We've had a site called Behance. Behance is, the most popular site for creative professionals in terms of how they showcase their content and get inspired. So, Adobe has had a multi-decade history of engaging with our customers. In this particular case, we were very, very ruthless about ensuring that the content on which our models were trained is content that we have absolute license for. I think other companies have not been as strict or as diligent about ensuring that the content that they use to train the models, as we all know, the more data that you have to train the models, the better the models are. And so our approach has been always to make sure that this is bulletproof in terms of having rights to it and just engaging with the community. We've also talked about how, as we continue to have our stock service, which is a very popular image 3D service, that we will compensate the people who are participating in that. So it's a thoughtful approach. It's the beginning of the journey. But most important, it's transparency and engagement with our community.
Shantanu, you are thoughtful. And you are thinking about ethics, and you just mentioned TikTok. So I just have to go there for a moment. What do you make of the business?
Well, I think from my perspective, every few years you have multiple platforms. And for me, when I think about TikTok or I think about the other platforms, it's really this insatiable appetite that people have for both consuming and for creating content. And so, I am not as familiar with all of the issues that others are perhaps concerned about. But from my perspective and the role that Adobe can play, it's like, how do we allow people to express themselves? And I think that insatiable appetite is not going to go away.
Of course, when it comes to authorities analyzing tech businesses like TikTok, there's some authorities eyeing M&A here in the US, in particular the DOJ analyzing your deal for Figma. At the moment, how integral is the Figma deal to your generative AI movement forward? How integral is that deal full stop? Will you fight to protect it?
Well, from our perspective, the strategic rationale for why we are excited about Figma is three things. We believe that we can accelerate product design, which enables new interactive experiences to be built for digital medium. The second reason is we think we can actually extend all of our products to do creative collaboration on the web and allow more stakeholders to participate, much like we did with our acquisitions of Workfront and Frame.io. And third, I think that there's this new emerging paradigm where the distinction between collaboration, creativity, and productivity is rapidly diminishing. And everybody who wants to create a school project or a document wants to engage in it both using words and text and images and animation. So strategically, we think that it is a real extension of what we do. The Figma business is an adjacency for us. I know there have been some questions about what does this mean for our core business. As we showed, our core business is extremely strong, so we're doing this from a position of strength. We're confident about our position in this. It's such an adjacency.
Yeah.
The overlap is de minimis to none, but we will engage with the authorities.
Would you ever abandon the deal if you had to?
Well, at this point, given we are confident about, the deal terms, we will just continue to operate with the authorities. And, that's what we're focused on, which is how do we, continue to deliver value to customers and demonstrate why this is a good thing for the community, for customers, and another important thing for the economy. If companies that are being created, the US has been the hotbed of entrepreneurship. It is really critical that there be economic outcomes that are appropriate for startups as well. So at this point, we're really focused on continuing to impress upon the authorities why this is good.
Full circle back to the macro there. Adobe CEO, we thank you so much. Shantanu Narayan, we'll let you get back to your summit. Now, speaking of artificial intelligence, Tencent President Martin Lau played, well, up the company's prospects in international gaming and AI this year. He called it a growth multiplier and said that Tencent will gradually integrate AI capabilities across its suite of products, from WeChat to online media. Now, the news comes as Tencent's revenue inched 1% higher after 2 successive quarters of contractions. That's with a 15% jump in online advertising revenue in particular in the final 3 months of 2022. Coming up, fintech to the rescue, with startups like Brex moving to provide emergency funding to companies following SVB's fallout. We'll discuss all that and plenty more, like their own new travel opportunities, with the co-CEO, Enrique Dubugras. That's next. This is Bloomberg. Wall Street leaders and US officials are discussing an intervention at First Republic Bank, exploring the possibility of government backing to encourage a deal that would shore up the lender. This after we learned today that PacWest has beefed up liquidity after a deposit exodus from its venture banking segment. So much going on with these lenders. Meanwhile, fintech startups like Arc, like Tranche, like Brex, they have moved to provide emergency funding to companies. Brex told Bloomberg it had seen record business and in excess of $1 billion in payroll loan requests from startups that have funds trapped in Silicon Valley Bank. Joining us now to discuss the macro, but also innovations of their own, Enrique Dubugras is Brex co-CEO, who is not only onboarding at a rapid rate, but you're also announcing new product offerings to boot. Enrique, just talk to us as a highly valued startup in this environment that's been looking to service finance professionals in particular with your offerings. How have you managed to deal with the rapid uptick in people wanting to be on board? What's the SVB fallout been like?
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you so much for having me on the show. It's been honestly one of the craziest weeks of my professional career of everything that's happening, and something sad for the technology industry. We definitely signal our support to SVB and hope they have a successful outcome with the regulators. What happened was, since the fallout, I think a lot of customers moved from wanting to have a relationship with one bank to wanting to have multiple relationships. And I think Brex, as kind of like another company that is startup friendly and knows the startup market, has been one of the, I would say, most common choices for startups wanting to diversify their funds, from keeping maybe some on SVB, some on Brex, and some on some of the big banks as well. So we've been seeing a lot of inflow of deposits and new customers because of that.
Enrique, I asked this to the Pilot CEO yesterday, again, another company servicing largely startups in the space. Do you worry about your own consolidation of the types of people that you're offering your products to?
Yeah, absolutely. So even though Brex started with startups and we're very well known for it back in 2017, we actually serve a variety of industries today. We serve media companies and beer companies, CPG. So we have a pretty diversified industries in our products, and because we're not a bank, right, we're not susceptible, I would say, to bank runs because we're a cash management account. So I'm not super worried about the same problems that the banks are having because we are not a bank. But even though we got a lot of, you go ahead.
Well, no, Enrique, let's talk about what you are. Let's talk about what in particular the Empower platform is, because it's cards, it's expenses management, but it's also travel now. This is a new iteration, a new announcement that you've got. How hard is it to iterate, to bring new offerings to the table when you're also trying to onboard like mad?
Yeah, for sure. So think about it as all spend, right? So we have corporate cards that we started, and we went to expense management, our business account products, so you can make wires, ACH checks, and today we're announcing travel. So now not only you're going to be able to book your travel on different websites, but inside the Brex app, you can book all your travel in a super easy way, and you can have the experience from your entire travel, from booking the trip to swiping through your credit card in restaurants and Ubers that you may need on your business expenses, that you don't need receipts, you don't need memos, everything is automated to you, all the approvals are automated, and you can keep everyone on budget with our live budget system. So a lot of companies we're seeing are trying to control their travel costs, and a lot of them are saying, hey, you should just travel, take 2 stops, on the way to San Francisco, New York, because it's cheaper. We're saying don't do that. Give accountability to your managers to actually choose the trips that they let their teams do and keep everyone on budget.
What are you seeing with your clients in this macro environment? We're thinking of the Fed today. We're thinking of, financial issues in terms of, the conditions are contracting in many ways. Are you seeing that from your client perspective in terms of they trimming their costs?
Absolutely. And I think that's, a net positive for our industry. I think everyone is learning how to do more with less and using even more technology to learn how to do more with less, right? And I think a lot of the AI revolution, for example, that we're seeing with generative AI, we announced an AI product also a few weeks ago that you're going to be able to ask any questions you would want to the finance team and have an AI respond to you. Can I buy this? How do I buy this? Where do I get this approved? How on budget? I'm spending too much on this. These are all questions that would take up the finance team to go and do reports and now can be answered by an AI, right? So I think this part of doing more with less is something that is actually going to be really positive for the technology industry, which was a little bit, bloated over the last few years because of the excess money. And I think it will be super positive. And a lot of our products are helping companies do that, like I mentioned, with our travel products and the live budgets.
Enrique, thank you for coming on, telling us your story and what it's been like in the last week or so. Enrique Dubagras, we thank you, Brex co-CEO. Meanwhile, coming up, we're going to walk you through everything you need to know before tomorrow's TikTok hearing on Capitol Hill. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
To achieve our sales target in 2023. So in short, strong revenue growth together with tightened spending are the key for the improvement of our profitability.
That was the CFO of Chinese EV maker NIO saying they will be meeting their target of doubling sales to 250,000 electric vehicles this year. Now that takes us to today's Talking Tech, and we're sticking with EVs. First up, Ford. The company taking small steps towards revealing losses in the EV business. Now the automaker will unveil an overhauled financial reporting structure for its redesigned company that really lays out the profit and the loss of each business line. The new look balance sheet will give investors a more complete view of Ford's nascent EV business, including expenses, of course, and revenue, how much money it's actually losing. Turning now to chips, the Biden administration unveiling tight restrictions on new operations in China by chip makers that get federal funds to build in the United States. Look, the $50 billion Chips and Science Act will now bar firms that win grants from expanding output in China by 5% for advanced chips or 10% for older technology. The Commerce Department also outlined other measures, including, look, an $100,000 spending cap on investments in advanced capacity in the country. And sticking with China and the Biden administration, the US is assessing whether Silicon Valley Bank's collapse inflicted more pain on Chinese technology startups than the government in Beijing and indeed Chinese companies have disclosed. The Biden administration is pulling together data on Chinese companies that may have accounts with regional US banks. The key question is whether there is any risk of broader contagion in the world's second largest economy. Sticking with Chinese companies, the CEO of TikTok will appear before the House Energy and Commerce Committee tomorrow in an effort to prevent TikTok's ban or forced sale. We go now to Capitol Hill, where our own Alex Barinka is standing by. And overall, what are you expecting to hear? Do we think that Shou-Chu, the CEO, can really push back on the viewpoint coming from the lawmakers right now?
Well, according to his prepared remarks that he plans on giving tomorrow, pushback is exactly what he's trying to do. His remarks are very definitive, saying things like ByteDance, TikTok's parent company, is not an agent of the Chinese government or any other country. He'll also say that the security plan in concert with Oracle is an American plan, storing American users' data on American soil by an American company. So he's coming in with kind of a really definitive tone here for his first testimony on Capitol Hill.
Overall, has the lobbying been present? Has the viewpoint, is anything that we're going to hear tomorrow actually going to be new in some way, do you think?
It's really interesting you asked that, Caroline. It is sounding like a lot of the same talking points, the facts that Chu likes to lean into. He's going to be bringing those into the Hill tomorrow, talking about the security plan, talking about how he believes that TikTok is doing more to protect young users, which will definitely be on the mind of the representatives who are in the room. Now, look, these are a lot of points that we are familiar with. They're the points that our sources tell us they have been bringing to lawmakers in those closed-door meetings ahead of the Hill. So he's facing a pretty tough crowd. Honestly, when you think about what is a win for him tomorrow, it's almost to do no more damage than the sentiment has already been done. And if anything, start to ingratiate or kind of humanize TikTok and lay that line clear that he believes there's no chance that the Chinese government can exert any influence on the app.
Very briefly, Alex, do you think he'll reference US social media companies?
I think he will, if not by name, then by tune, saying, hey, look, we're actually doing more on data protection. We're doing more on trust and safety policy. So maybe you should be worried about all of us and not just TikTok.
Alex Barinka, great to have you on from DC. Go and check out her work. We've got some great reporting from her on Instagram and across our TikTok accounts too. Meanwhile, coming up, the impact of SVB's meltdown on non-traditional founders. We'll discuss all of that next with Joanna Strober, CEO and co-founder of a virtual care clinic for women 40 years and older. So get rid of that tech bro visual when you think about Silicon Valley. That's next. Meanwhile, let's check back in tech stocks right now. We're counting you down to the Federal Reserve decision. Well, we see a 1/4 point hike in rates. NASDAQ flat on the day. Golden Dragon in China off by 0.8. This is Bloomberg.
Now, keeping you up to date with news from around the world, here's the first word. I'm Mark Crumpton. Switzerland's additional Tier 1 bonds are paying the price for the controversial write-down of Credit Suisse's notes. Data compiled by Bloomberg show yields on Swiss banks' AT1 notes have jumped more than similar bonds issued by European lenders since the wipeout of 17 billion Credit Suisse notes. In the case of UBS, the largest remaining AT1 issuer in Switzerland, the yield premium over similar bonds in the rest of Europe has tripled since Friday. Garbage collectors in Paris will continue to strike through next Monday in protest to President Emmanuel Macron's bill to raise the minimum retirement age. For the past 2 weeks, streets in the French capital have been littered with overflowing trash containers. Some were even set on fire by protesters. Officials say an estimated 9,500 tons of trash are still on the city's sidewalks, with only about 100 garbage trucks in service. The Manhattan grand jury that has been meeting regarding Donald Trump's so-called hush money case was told not to come in today. That's according to Insider, which says it's unlikely the jury would meet at all this week, though nothing is set in stone. The delay comes on the brink of a possible historic indictment vote of the former president. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Originals, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Technology. I'm Caroline Hyde in New York. It is 9:30 on the West Coast. It is 12:30 right here in New York. It's 4:30 p.m. in London. Stocks just finishing up the day in European trading. Kriti Gupta, you got the breakdown.
Yeah, Caroline, green on the screen in the European session. This is really interesting because traditionally, when you are having an FOMC decision, stocks around the world pull out. They are selling off. Not today. In fact, you're seeing a little bit more of perhaps positivity, but I wouldn't say a ton of conviction, a ton of momentum. In fact, if you look at the volume on a 30-day average, it is down by a lot. A lot of folks on the sidelines, which kind of explains why you're seeing some meager gains in the likes of the stocks Europe 600, about up 0.2%. And the France is really where you're seeing the outperformance. But again, not a ton to write home about, higher by 0.3% there. The DAX as well, stronger by 0.2% in Germany, really saying that, look, even the very, very high inflation data we got in the UK is not going to stump those gains. Really a question of autopilot in those indexes. The FTSE 100 I thought was interesting, higher by 0.4%. But I wonder how much of that is simply a reaction to what you're seeing in the yield space, because yields across the curve around the world are down. And that's really where the pause mentality in the kind of European session, comes to fruition. Coming ahead of the FOMC decision, earlier in the pre-market, they were down by a lot. Now you're seeing that volatility in the opposite direction, with yields higher across the curve in the European session. For me, I got to say, what takes the cake is that UK two-year yield surprise inflation that we're seeing across the Atlantic, higher by 23 basis points. Caroline, how's that for volatility?
Oof. Inflation is still so rampant across the Atlantic. And meanwhile, all eyes in the financial and the economic world are laser focused, of course, on what Federal Chair Jay Powell is going to be saying today. He's going to be trying to balance his fight against inflation, like we just saw in the UK, against, look, a sudden banking crisis that's erupted. And as part of that, there are ongoing concerns about funding for startups, funding for those that have been hit by the SVB collapse, and ongoing concerns that we have today on First Republic and now PacWest. And yes, you may not realize it, but not all of these people are tech bros, because there are also non-traditional founders, many that don't necessarily get thought of when we see and say Silicon Valley, who also have been affected by this crisis. In a Bloomberg opinion piece, MIDI Health co-founder and CEO Joanna Strober writes that while the Silicon Valley ecosystem has plenty of men with bulging egos, there is another group quietly building startups there, many of whom were supported by Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic Bank. Founders like yourself. Joanna, I'm very pleased to say I can welcome to the program. And I'm glad you got the blue memo. I'm really interested, Joanna, in this piece, this thought leadership, and how has a business like yours been affected by the last couple of weeks?
You know, like anyone else, it's been a really stressful experience. It was not clear over the weekend whether we would be able to make our payroll the following week. It wasn't clear whether the company would succeed, and so it was definitely a stressful experience trying to figure out how to get everything secured and be sure we'd be able to continue to keep all of our employees. You know, we have employees all over the country, and we wanted to make sure they would still have jobs. Employees
like nurses, health practitioners. You're a women's health startup. You were founded to focus on menopause, on perimenopause in particular, and it's almost the antithesis of what perhaps we all started to think of and got a lot of notoriety during the unfolding of the collapse of SVB. We all thought about these rather loud, white male tech bros who were on Twitter complaining loudly in all caps. Meanwhile, this was about to affect the broader economy. How has the conversation gone behind the scenes among women, diverse founders, people of color who perhaps felt that this wasn't a great PR exercise for their industry?
Many of them felt very ignored, quite honestly. When you read Twitter over the weekend or you read the mainstream media, no one was talking about the healthcare companies or the education companies or the clean technology companies. No one was talking about female founders. All the discussion was about this very small group of very verbal, outspoken men on Twitter who were loudly protesting the fact that their companies would be hurt. But the reality is there are so many more people reflected in Silicon Valley. There were also people who run nonprofits whose money was in these banks. There's people who run camps whose money in these banks. And so none of those people felt heard during this. And I think there was a lot of sense of, wow, like we have, tens of thousands of employees around the country doing really important things, and no one is talking about us.
And it almost felt sort of insult to injury was that we were just coming off the back, I'm sure you were, of a lot of female-focused events. It was, of course, International Women's Day the week before, and there was a lot of talk about diversity and trying to build that momentum within the tech scene. Among VCs, you used to be one. Among founders, you now are one. And I'm interested as to whether people are now banding together a little bit more to try and amplify voices, rather than just you single-handedly trying to put about op-eds at the moment.
I think there's a lot of sense that we need to be part of the story, right? That we need to be part of the narrative, and the women realize that they need to be a much bigger part of the discussion about what's going on in Silicon Valley. The percentage of women who are funding companies is increasing. The percentage of women who are founding companies are increasing, and we need to be part of that narrative. We need to be in the mainstream press and not just doing this quietly behind the scenes. We need to be much more verbal about what we're doing. And I think there's certainly a sense of a lot of founders that we need to be expressing much more about the importance of our companies and the importance of our companies to the overall nation, because these companies are making a really big impact in all sorts of areas, including education and healthcare, and we need to make sure those voices are amplified.
Are you worried that any of those businesses aren't going to make it at the moment that are solving key issues?
I think that the Silicon Valley Bank issues this week are going to make it harder for, at least in the short term, for companies to get funded. And I also think that often when these things happen, there's a retrenching to entrepreneurs that they're most confident in, and also those are often more traditional entrepreneurs. Silicon Valley Bank and First Republic Bank did a great job at supporting non-traditional entrepreneurs and women, and I'm hoping that however those go forward, those new organizations will continue to be really supportive and not just focus on a core group, but on expanding the percentage of entrepreneurs in the country. And actually, I really hope that it gets expanded nationwide and not just in the United States.
Well, look, we were just speaking with one of those companies, a fintech that has sort of been lent upon more in this current environment, like Brex. Are these fintechs, or indeed, more mature, are the banks that people have turned to, some of them leaning on some of the most systemically important banks in the country, are they as open to lending to companies like yours?
Yes, they are, actually. I mean, I think there's been an acknowledgement that women are a much bigger part of the ecosystem, people of color are a much bigger part of the ecosystem, and they are starting to get access to capital. And that's what's really important, is they have great ideas. In order to make those ideas come to fruition, you need access to capital. And so anything you can do, like those non-traditional funding sources that can enable more people to get the funding to start these companies, then you're able to grow. And that's really the key to starting a company in Silicon Valley or any place else, is getting access to capital to do that. And we need to expand the number of people who are able to get access to that capital.
Now, media organizations such as ourselves care about getting your voice on. The media organizations such as ourselves help train people to ensure that we can get enough new voices coming on certain programs. But I'm interested in what else you can do other than write in cap locks on certain social media companies to hear voices heard. What do you think underneath the system is happening at the moment so that you're all galvanized?
You know, it's easy sometimes to write about the loudest people. And so part of it is encouraging people who maybe are quietly building very large companies to spend more time on the press. I think often when you're building a company, you spend so much time doing that you're actually not enough in the spotlight and talking about these issues to the national audience. And so probably training people to do that and to be more aware of what's going on in the world. When you start doing a startup, you're really focused every day. I mean, we are spending time every day trying to make sure that things run, that we do a great job with our care, that we're taking care of all these women. And then you forget to actually look up once in a while and go, oh, you know, I really need to be thinking about the national press as well. And so it's actually important that everyone knows how to do that.
Midi Health co-founder and CEO, Joanna Strober, thank you so much for coming, sharing your journey of late with us. See you soon. Meanwhile, coming up, we're going to be joined by Initialized Capital's Kim Cutler, who actually was one of those VCs behind the scenes working amid the SVB fallout to educate policymakers on what was happening in the unfolding banking crisis. And staying in Washington, taking a look at bank stocks right now, the US officials discussing an intervention perhaps at First Republic Bank. That's Bloomberg exclusive reporting. We've got PacWest, of course, taking help on the liquidity side today. Both down pre that Federal Reserve decision. From New York, from Washington, this is Bloomberg. Shortly, we'll be getting the rate decision from the Fed. We'll also be hearing about what Jay Powell thinks about the ongoing bank crisis, of course, SVB's collapse, the fallout, and its impact we're going to now digest on startups, on the VC world at large. Kim Cutler is with us, I'm pleased to say, partner over at Initialized Capital. Joining us now, and what's so fascinating about your role in the last couple of weeks is, of course, that you were one of perhaps 50 or so at least, leaders in VC quietly trying to help policymakers understand the ripple effects of what an SVB true collapse would have meant. We ultimately got, well, the support of the depositor. What do you make of government intervention thus far?
I've actually been very engaged with public policymakers over the last 10 years. I started writing about issues around housing affordability in the Bay Area in California about 10 years ago, and then I was part of the formation of an organization that shepherds about half a dozen pieces of legislation into state law every year. And so I have this kind of deep bench of expertise and a deep network around engaging with public policymakers. And so there are a circle of us that are about 50, 100 or more folks in the venture capital industry and tech founders who have been communicating for a very, very long time around the implications of our industry with respect to governance and the larger community and society at large. And so, on Friday morning, when we saw that the FDIC had put Silicon Valley Bank into receivership, there was all the internal work that we were doing at Initialized Capital of the firm in terms of triaging our portfolio, figuring out who had to make payroll, the next week. And then also at the same time, I was doing a lot more external-facing work with this group of 50 or so folks, literally in a WhatsApp chat group, figuring out how to draft memos to send out to policymakers to help them understand the real-world implications of this. For a startup, not only was it the issue of figuring out how to pay talent and to pay employees the following week, even the level of uncertainty around, what the initial dividend was going to be. Startups make very explicit plans over, how they're going to spend their burn and runway over a matter of months and years, and then not having certainty over that really, throws a wrench into their ability to provide their team members with, the kind of long-term support that they need. And so just getting that message across was really important.
Because have you had to decide who are your winners, who are your losers? Are you having to dial back on writing checks at this moment just because of the enveloping crisis that's around us?
No, not at all. I mean, we're doing deals every week. I mean, I made an offer last week, in fact. So, I mean, we're very, very active. But for what we needed to do, last Friday is we went through the portfolio. We had to figure out who banked with whom. If they banked with SVB, what was their level of exposure, how much they were able to transfer out versus not, if they had to make payroll the following week. And then we had to go and figure out what our actual, literal immediate exposure was. And that was actually, thankfully, pretty small. But, we had to be prepared to be in a position to help our companies, pay their employees. So, we didn't end up having to do that because of the announcement on Sunday afternoon, thankfully. But it was definitely an incredibly stressful weekend. And I remember getting the news that morning. I actually worked for Bloomberg, 15 years ago. And so, I was just, I had this feeling of, oh my gosh, this is like the Lehman day. This is going to be a Lehman. This is going to be a Lehman weekend.
But then you're still writing checks. And so who do you write checks to? Is it only generative AI companies? Are you still able to remain focused on the breadth of types of founders that you back? Because you've got 175 plus active portfolio companies. You're across climate to fintech to, you name it, the sector you're on.
Yeah, Initialized Capital has always been a generalist seed firm, and we've always kind of let the best and brightest founders kind of take us to, whatever the next trend is. I've been doing a lot of deals in the climate space. We have another, our managing partner, Brett Gibson, has done a lot of deals. He's increasingly looking at generative AI and has a long, deep history in doing, crypto and crypto deals as well. And so, we do a lot of deals in a lot of different spaces. For me, because of my background, as I mentioned at the beginning, climate obviously has a lot of implications, in terms of getting the private sector and private entrepreneurs to innovate and getting them to work with public policymakers to address this, just enormous problem.
How confident are you that problems like that can be solved at this moment when you're having to put together memos for policymakers called cascade bank failure scenarios? Are we still in that scenario right now? Or do you think you can get back to the job of writing checks and founders building companies?
I honestly think more of the, obviously in, the day-to-day bank stability coverage that you're doing, I think it's probably affecting your side more than it is ours now. I think the FDA, the Feds, the FDIC coming to assure depositors at SVB was a really important signal for a lot of founders and investors in the space. And so like the immediate payroll needs and that concern has been assuaged. And so we are continuing to do new deals. Obviously, we're making, we're being much more proactive about the advice we're giving in terms of how founders and companies should diversify where they're having holdings, and being much more thoughtful around, where they have access to short-term cash versus where they're keeping their kind of midterm needs.
We all learned a lot about treasury management all of a sudden. Initialized Capital partner Kim Cutler, it's great to have some time with you. Thank you. Meanwhile, coming up, all eyes on the all-important Fed decision. Just hours away, we count you down and assess what that means for risk assets, the publicly traded ones, and of course, if you're writing checks to the private ones still. And speaking of risk assets, we're watching shares at GameStop today, surging as much as 51% in its biggest move since March 2021, after reporting a surprise profit on the fourth quarter, beating the actually rather few analysts that actually give us estimates for this company. That stock is lifting other meme stock names, though, as well. We'll bring you more throughout. This is Bloomberg. By the way, the all-important Fed decision is just, about an hour away. What will the Fed say about the state of jobs? I mean, we're going to talk about it from a tech sector perspective, but layoffs more broadly. And what will all this mean, of course, amid risk asset appetite following a bank crisis that still seems to be looming? Let's bring in Bloomberg's Michael McKee. He's over there in Washington. Bloomberg's Sonali Basak right here in New York. And Mike, to start, the balancing act from Jay Powell is going to be a tough one. The bank crisis on one side, inflation on the other.
The Fed doesn't want to mix the two, but it's sort of impossible. The chairman is obviously going to talk about whatever they do on the monetary policy side, but they've always believed that monetary policy is not a good tool for banking issues. They want to use supervisory, regulatory powers that they have to deal with those. So he'll talk about the banking system in general being in good shape, and that the Fed is doing whatever it needs to do to keep the banking system from imploding. But they want to separate that out from the monetary policy implications of inflation and the fact that inflation is still their biggest concern.
Sonali, is the banking sector in good shape?
I think something to look at here is what happened over at PacWest, because you see them disclosing that 20% of their deposits were under pressure this year alone. Listen, a lot of that was tied to the venture community as well. So while you've seen First Republic really have ripple effects spilling into other banks, there's a question about which deposits, whose depositors at what banks are really under pressure. Certainly the technology community, their ripple effect into other banks, as you see with PacWest, as you see with First Republic, is still of alarm and of concern here. Now, how this continues to ripple on is still an unknown. And you did see PacWest find a private sector solution here with an entity that was really created by Apollo stepping in to provide a loan. Something interesting here is we had reported that Apollo was among the potential buyers of Silicon Valley Bank assets. This shows you that not all assets are all that attractive to every private equity firm.
And Mike, with the NASDAQ under pressure, we've got 30 seconds. Is it 25 basis points that's baked in?
It looks like it. It's about an 80% chance, according to futures trading, which is not quite certain, but that's the way the market's leaning.
Mike McKee, we'll let you get back to preparing for the all-important drop of news. Sonali Basak all over the things with the banks. We thank her. Stay with Bloomberg, our special Bloomberg surveillance. The Fed decides. The coverage is starting at 1:30 p.m. New York time. That does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. Ed, get well soon. This is Bloomberg.